Do we know anything about Jesus, and how can we know it's true? How reliable are the sources? And if we're investigating this subject, should we try to use criterion that would be applicable in any other process? So today, I will endeavor to show several different ways of approaching this subject in an effort to show if one is going to indulge looking, how we should maybe approach, and this is just one method, there are many methods. So, first criteria, early evidence. And I'm going to put evidences, if you will. The earlier the better. Materials dating from anywhere from 30 to 70 AD will be called early evidences. And number 2 ties into number 1, which is eyewitnesses. And don't think that you know exactly where I'm going. Eyewitnesses who actually witnessed or participated in some event that is recorded. And there's a historian, his name is David Hatchlet Fisher. He's coined the term rule of immediacy. 3, we have independent attestation, and some of these attestation, wow, this is going to look good, of an event that is reported by more than one source. 3 may tie into 2. 4, which is very important, a criterion of what is called, we'll call it lack of continuity within the body of evidence. There's actually a term for that called discontinuity or dissimilarity. Number 5, they all kind of dovetail together. Coherence. So if events or teaching fit within what is already known concerning persons, places, or events, there's coherence there. I know I'm not going to get to this today, but I'll put it in anyway. Foreign words that appear within the gospel records which need to be addressed, and if I don't get to it today, at some point I will. Number 7 would be negative or shameful reporting, something that is not flattering to the events being recorded. And last but not least will be archaeological. I'm not going to try and, I'll put this like this, archae, you'll understand what that means. So I'm going to start with number 1. Let's start with an examination of documents outside the New Testament, because a lot of people say, well, the documents themselves, these things that you're talking about, are they even reliable? I'm not even going to go there right now, because that's a whole different message. So we have Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, who wrote his epistle to the Philippians in approximately 120 AD. He quotes the New Testament over 60 times. What may indicate that this individual had abundant time to process and recall these quotes is the fact that these quotes are not simply parroted in a way, they fit and flow so perfectly. Now I ask you a question. Could you, if you just heard something randomly, repeat and quote back 60 different quotes within a letter or within a body of writing? I don't think so. Epistle of Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch. He wrote 7 short epistles. He was martyred in 115 AD. And in his 7 short epistles, they contain unmistakable quotes from Matthew, Luke, and John. The Epistle of Barnabas. The author identifies himself as one of you. He quotes the sayings of Jesus. He is aware of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but not of the rebellion in 132 AD. That gives us a proper date. And the great Bishop Lightfoot, biblical scholar, put that particular epistle sometime after 70 AD, but before 80 AD. These are all very important. Why? Because if you remember, we're talking about early evidences, and I started at the outer number. 120, 115, we're working our way down. First Clement was Bishop of Rome during the last part of the 1st century. His letters to the church at Corinth, in writing, the date is greatly debated, but some put the date as early as 70 AD and as late as 95 AD. You might say, well, what does this all have to do with anything? Well, all of these people are quoting source material that's coming straight out of the Gospels. I should say synoptics. It is impossible for us to kind of say, well, did these people make this up? No, it's already been perpetuated. It's already been transmitted. It's already spread. If you hear, we're outside of Asia Minor. We're into Rome. We're into other far-flung places. Justin Martyr, who lived in the first half of the 2nd century, testifies in the first apology that the common worship in the church in his day was from readings of the memoirs of the apostles. In the same work, he later refers to the memoirs as the Gospels. And as you know, now I'm back to the outer edge. The first harmony of the Gospels was done by Tacitus in 170 AD. He was the leader of a church at Antioch, and basically he took the Gospel records and harmonized them to make them flow together in a one, basically his diatessaron, the word means through the four, to make fluid so that one didn't necessarily need all these books. You could read his diatessaron, basically compiling the four in a fluid way. About the same time, a manuscript known now as the Meritonian Fragment compiled a list of New Testament books. Fragments of that have partially survived. Now, what's staggering about that is we're talking about 170 approximately AD with a list of New Testament books. We're talking about a very small timeline if you think about it. But if we're interested in early evidences, some may say, well, this doesn't count when you get outside of the realm of, say, 100 AD, because you're now probably dealing with eyewitnesses to eyewitnesses. And this is where it becomes interesting. You've got people like Irenaeus writing before 200 AD. Now we're at the very outer edge, far away from early evidence, if you will. He lists all the Gospels in familiar order: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's by the year 200. That's pretty remarkable. The earliest evidence concerning the Gospels and their authorship comes to us from a man named Papias. He was Papias. He was a bishop of Asia Minor during the early part of the 2nd century. I want to read to you what is recorded of what he said. And this is very important because we know for a fact that Papias had contact with John, the writer of the Gospel of John. He had eyewitness, first-hand contact. We know that unequivocally. But this is what Papias writes. And thank God he's not reading my handwriting. I shall not hesitate also to put into proper order form for you everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders and noted down well, for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I did not enjoy those who have a great deal to say, but those who teach the truth. Nor did I enjoy those who recall someone else's commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from truth itself. And if by chance anyone had been in attendance on the elders, and see very carefully what he means by this. He means Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, John, James, Matthew, etc. And you'll see why in a second. He says, and if by chance anyone had been in attendance on the elders, that is according to what the elders, Andrew or Peter, said, or Philip, Thomas, or James, John, or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples. And whatever Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying, for I did not think that information from a book would profit me as much as from living, surviving voices. Why does this become important? I'll tell you why. And this will be a repeated theme. According to the historian Eusebius, Papias said, now Matthew collected the oracles in the Hebrew language, and he goes on to talk about this. But why this is important will make sense in a minute. Because most people know, and you'll hear me date some of the Gospels to a much earlier date from new information that has come about through different ways of testing and looking at materials, analyzing handwriting, analyzing papyrus, etc., that most people will put most of the writing, the bulk of the writing, Matthew, Mark, John, and Luke, in the early 50s to early mid-60s AD, and that is only some 20 to 30 years after the Lord's death. The question is, why at times do we have these late dates of material that have been circulated? And I believe Papias answers that question. He says, "For I did not think that information from a book would profit me as much as listening to a living, surviving voice." And I think that was probably the mindset even of the disciples. Remember, they answered the Great Commission: go out, teach, and make disciples, make learners. And I'm sure that after a while of repeating what they had heard, that became basically etched in their mind, it became clear, we need to write this down so this can become a greater circulated, more widely read, if you will. But the reason for the delay may be exactly what Papias says. The mindset was that they preferred to hear it from a living, surviving person. So that could answer a potential question. Now, there's some interesting things to look at concerning Matthew's gospel. A lot of people question, it's really, I'm not going to get too much into this, I'm going to just touch lightly on this, but a lot of people will debate the authenticity, for example, of Matthew's writing. I cannot debate it, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I've scrutinized this for so long, and I'd love for anyone to send me any of your challenging ideas. I welcome any of those challenges. I'm not a closed-minded person. But we know that Matthew was a tax collector. He most likely also was there's a text within Matthew's gospel that talks about scribing, which means potentially Matthew may have come from a lineage of scribes, potentially. But more importantly, I want you to think about something. Matthew spends more time talking about money than any other writer of the New Testament outside of Paul. The parable of the talents is Matthew only. Gold and silver references 28 times. You only have these references once in Mark and once in Luke. 2 drachmas in the temple tax, the Greek word stater in Matthew 17:25. Even the disciples, the Lord's Prayer, the disciples' prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. However you want to understand the verbiage, he speaks more about money. And think about this. If that's your vocation, that may be something that you're going to be really focused on. I know people, their vocation is XYZ, that's all they talk about. So there's certain internal things that if I were to take the time and pick apart each one of these writers, I think I could line up enough proof. I could put a column of things to doubt and things to look at in a scrutinized fashion and maybe even cast more doubt, but the column of things that could be confirmed as internal evidences to confirm the authenticness, if you will, and the authority of the writer, I think outweigh the doubts. Now, on the part of the book bearing Mark's name, we know that Mark became Peter's secretary or interpreter. That means that Peter told Mark everything that's contained in Mark's gospel. So Mark's gospel is only, think of Mark, there's a term for it, amanuensis, which is a secretary. Think of Mark as Peter's secretary, and there's a sequence. If you want to follow eyewitness to eyewitness to eyewitness type things, Peter tells Mark, John the elder tells Papias. Papias speaks in the first part of the 2nd century, and then you get all of this perpetuated, and it becomes a little bit down the road, maybe even a little bit like broken telephone. But we have some good source material at the start. We know that Mark's mother owned a large house in Jerusalem, and his cousin Barnabas, who was also a prominent Christian, they both came from a certain pedigree, which would kind of make us understand why Mark wrote. See, writing was not a common thing in that day. So to scrutinize this, you also have to look at the how, the what, the when, the where, and the why. Mark would have been educated enough to take down Peter's verbiage and put it into a flow. And very easily, we place Mark's writing in the late 50s. Now, there are a lot of people that are going to debate these dates, but even if you want to push it into the early 60s, we're talking 61-ish, okay? But again, this is all in the proximity. Go back to my first thing here, early evidences. It all goes back to, and the eyewitnesses, and even the independent attestations. Here we have different people attesting to events. They are all with common thread. They are not different events happening in different times. So, as I said, there is a lot that can be threaded together here. Now, on the subject of Luke, and this is an interesting one, and seldom is addressed properly. Luke penned the book bearing his name and a large portion, if not the total portion, of the book of Acts. The book of Acts is probably dated to somewhere in the early 60s as well, 62, 64. But what is anomalous about Luke is Luke was not with Jesus' disciples, as in he's never named as part. He is Paul's traveling companion. He says at the outset that he wants to put all things in order. So he's a physician. He would have been fairly educated enough, and we can tell in his writing distinctly the style of his writing is different than Matthew, it's different than Mark, it's certainly different than John. So this gives a good explanation. It doesn't tell you a whole lot, but there are certain things I point out here that are very interesting. In Luke's genealogy, he traces Christ back to Adam, not just to Abraham, because essentially by the time he's writing, there is a clear understanding that Jesus is representing the headship of humanity, not just a descendant of Abraham. And the next thing that's relatively important is Luke mentions the city of Jerusalem about 30 times in the book bearing his name, and about 60 times in the book of Acts, far more than any other writer, with no mention of the destruction of the temple that would have taken place, or Jerusalem, in 70 AD. And why is this important? Because for a man who set out to set all things in order, there is no question in my mind he would have recorded and written down, had he been eyewitness to the destruction and fall in 70 AD, he would have written about it. Luke also records the martyrdom of Stephen, James, the brother of John, but is silent about the deaths of Peter and Paul and James, three prominent figures that die somewhere between 60 and 67, perhaps 68 AD at the outset. So if he had written afterwards, he would have surely chronicled and recorded for at least the church to know, the burgeoning church to know, what had happened to these potential pillars of the church. Now, number two, this is going to be a little bit tricky, so you got to bear with me. I originally was not going to do this, but eyewitnesses, the rule of immediacy. And this is the problem. When you get into analyzing a text, you start realizing that there may be much more evidence than you originally thought. And what constitutes an eyewitness? If you want a definition, well, look it up in the dictionary. But in essence, someone who has seen firsthand, who has seen we'll call it the center figure of these writings, either witnessed, was there, but are named, they are included. And at first I said, I'm not going to compile a list because it seems self-evident. But then I thought to myself, well, I'm going to get you started. And you who really have the time, knock yourselves out. But if you're talking about eyewitnesses, Lazarus, Mary, Martha, the 12 in the upper room, John the Baptist, Herod, Herodias, Caiaphas, Barnabas, Pilate, Cleopas, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Malchus, Simon of Cyrene, Jairus' daughter, Joseph of Arimathea, Salome, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, the leper, the centurion, the woman with the issue of blood, the blind man, the paralyzed man, the chief steward, the boy with the food, the 4,000, the 5,000. You want me to keep going? Because I think you get the idea that all those people, regardless of what you want to talk about, they all saw Jesus. This is what Paul talks about when he writes in 1 Corinthians, and he begins that catalog. These were eyewitnesses, and I didn't even mention Paul there. The next area I'm going to go to will be number 4, and the lack of continuity. And why would I put that as evidence? I'd put that as evidence because if every single writer lined up to say exactly the same thing in the same way, we might actually say they colluded together, they conspired together. Let's just make sure we use all the same verbiage. But here's what's interesting. When I use this criterion of dissimilarity, there's an even greater thing to note. If you want to follow me, I'm going to turn to certain passages to show you something that you've probably read by many times, but you don't really think about it. So in Matthew 26 and verse 67, we'll go back to verse 65. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, "He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye?" And they answered and said, "He is guilty of death." Then did they spit in his face, buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee?" Now, listen to me. It makes no sense if you read what you just heard me read. They're standing right in front of him. Why would they say prophesy? You have to go to Luke 22 and beginning at verse 63. "And the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him. And when they had blindfolded him," that's missing in Matthew's gospel. "And when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked, saying, Prophesy, who is it that smote thee?" I want you to think about that. That's a very large omission by Matthew. And if we just had Matthew's gospel, we'd think these people are lunatics to ask Jesus, if he's not blindfolded, to prophesy about who slapped him in the face. That's pretty self-evident. If you're not blindfolded, you would know. You don't have to be God to know that. But you've got to look to Luke's gospel to find that. And this is why I said these are these interesting internal evidences that they didn't sit down to cohesively. There is discontinuity, lack of continuity, but enough information that if you're reading from different parts, you put it together. I'll show you another one. This one's very, very clear as day. John 2, beginning at verse 18. "Then answered the Jews and said unto him," they're speaking to Jesus, "What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things?" Jesus answered and said unto them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews, they said, 46 years was this temple in building, and thou wilt rear it up in 3 days. But he spoke of the temple of his body. Now, you turn to Mark 14, beginning at verse 55. And if you don't want to make the journey with me, just listen closely. Beginning at verse 55 through 59. "And the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. For many bare false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." Now, what's a tragedy is that John does not record the false claim. Jesus never said, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands." He never said that. He never was even talking about a physical building. He was speaking of himself. You have to go to Mark 15:27, I believe. "And with him they crucified 2 thieves, one on his right hand and the other on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, And he was numbered with the transgressors. And they that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads, saying, that thou destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days. Save thyself and come down from the cross." So it's interesting. Here you can see those that were mocking him understood he was speaking. Save yourself. They knew he was speaking of himself. No one bothers to go back and correct the false witnesses who said something made with human hands. He never even spoke that. Now, again, there are some very interesting, what I'd call their lack of continuity. This one, this congregation is familiar with. Turn to John 6. John 6 is the infamous feeding, the account of feeding the 5,000. And you have Jesus asking, where can they buy bread? What's interesting is, why didn't Jesus ask Peter or anyone else instead of Philip? And we know that the first clue of why Jesus asked Philip, where can we buy bread? I'll just quote it. It's in John 1:44, because in John 1:44 it says, Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from this area. And again, if you turn now, I'll make you turn to Luke 9, because this all ties together to show you what's lacking here and what's picked up by another writer. 10 through 17. And the apostles, when they returned, told him all that they had done, and he took them and went aside privately into a desert place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. And the people, when they knew it, followed him, and he received them and spake unto them of the kingdom of God, and healed them that had need of healing. And when the day began to wear away, then came the 12 and said unto him, Send the multitude away, that we may go into the towns and country round about, and lodge, and get victuals, food, for we are here in a desert place. But he said unto them, Give ye them to eat. And they said, We have no more but 5 loaves and 2 fishes, except that we should go and buy meat for all this people. For when they were about 5,000 men, and he said to his disciples, Make them sit down by 50s in company. And they did so, and made them all sit down. And they took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, Jesus blessed them, brake them, gave them to the disciples, and set them before the multitude. And they did eat, and all were filled, and there was taken up fragments that remained of the 12 baskets. Now, why we have this multitude of people is not told unless you turn somewhere else. And the somewhere else, hopefully I'm reading this in right order, the somewhere else will be in back in Mark's gospel. Sorry to make you flip-flop, but that's the nature of this thing that we're doing today. So in Mark 6, you get those pages going, right? And the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both that they had done and what they had taught. And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And of course, it says they departed into a desert place by ship privately. Now, you want to know why there were so many people. I'm not going to turn there, just write it down somewhere. John 6:4 says why. The Jewish Passover was near. That means all of these people were going to one direction, and they were traveling in that one direction. This is why you had this great multitude of people. It wasn't simply that people were just randomly out there in the desert looking around for whatever they were. They were all basically on a pilgrimage in a direction. Why? The Jewish Passover was near. They would have been going to the epicenter of worship, the temple. So I'm going to give you one more, and then we'll move on from this particular place we're at. The next one occurs in Luke 23. And if you're tired of turning, rest your poor little hands. All right. Luke 23, and the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. Now we have basically the Jews washing their hands of Jesus and sending him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. And Pilate asked, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Now here's the issue with that. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault with this man, or in this man. Now listen to the charge. Let me go back and listen to the charge. We found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. By the way, that's false. Remember, he said, Render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, right? And that he himself is Christ a king. Now, you have to go somewhere else to understand why Pilate said, I find no fault in this man. If you're only reading Luke, you wouldn't get the whole picture. You turn to John's Gospel, and you find in John 18, and beginning at verse 33. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the King of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? And Jesus answered, Thou sayest I am a king. To this end I was born, and for this cause I came into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth, and every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. This is why Pilate in Luke said, I find no fault. This whole section technically is kind of missing to fill in the blanks. And this is why I say, when you study, you can't just read one and say, okay, that all makes sense, because you can see there's missing components. Now, if they all set up to align to one linear story and we all stick to the same verbiage, this would never have happened. And in fact, what's even more miraculous is that details are included in someone else's writing that were omitted somewhere else, and luckily we have the whole record to piece it together. Now, you can say, well, that's just coincidence, and I tell you, okay, sure, whatever you say. I don't think so. I think the likelihood of this being coincidence is slim and none, but that God worked it out this way is nothing short of a miracle in and of itself. Now, let's look at some other evidences in a different light. If you will, and if you're so inclined to turn to Matthew in chapter 2, we know that there basically is the rumblings of the birth of Jesus, of course. And when you get to but in verse 19, the Lord appeareth in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise and take thy young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And he arose and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea, in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside and into the parts of Galilee. Now let me stop right there. The historian Josephus, in his Antiquities 17.3.1, tells us that the domain of Herod the Great was divided amongst his sons. Archelaus had authority in Judea, but not in Galilee, where his younger brother Herod Antipas governed. We also know that Josephus, the Jewish historian, in his Antiquities 17.13.1 through 2 and 17.9.3, if you want to look it up, references how Archelaus slaughtered about 3,000 Jews at Passover. And because, by the way, there's constant confusion by people who are new to the Bible about who was ruling when. Matthew 2:22 has Archelaus ruling as king in Judea. Matthew 27:2 has Pilate as governor of Judea. Acts 12:1 has Herod is king of Judea. And Acts 23:33 has Felix as governor of Judea. Now, history, not the Bible, history records, go comb them, go search them out. Herod the Great was made king of Judea by Mark Antony. That is a historical fact. Archelaus was deposed in the year 6 AD after only a 10-year reign, and there were many procurators that ruled over Judea, Pilate being number 5 in a line of many. The Herod of Acts 12 is Agrippa I, made king by Claudius Caesar, and after his death, Judea was placed once more under the government of procurators, one of them being Felix. This is all historic. You can go to history books, look it up. So people say, well, I can't believe it. Well, I'm giving you enough information. But now I don't want us to just look at information from this book. I want you to look at something so mind-boggling that even for me it's mind-boggling. The Babylonian Talmud. This is a document written by and for a Jewish viewpoint. And these were hostile towards Jesus, of course. They were no admirers of Jesus Christ. The first important fact is that those responsible for the Babylonian Talmud are Jews who had every motive for wanting to eradicate Christ from history, every motive to just erase him. Now, there's a reference in the Babylonian Talmud that I have much to comment on, so just indulge me, I'm going to read the quote. I had to go back and see it for myself and wasn't trusting somebody else's translation, so I had to take the time to do it myself. That's the hard head that I am. They don't say Jesus, they say Yeshua was hanged on Passover Eve. Now pay close attention to what's said here, because there's a lot of fanciful things that come woven in here. Jesus, Yeshua, was hanged on Passover Eve. 40 days previously, the herald had cried, he's being led out for stoning because he has practiced sorcery and led Israel astray and enticed them to apostasy. Whosoever has anything to say in his defense, let him come forward and declare it. As nothing was brought forward in his defense, he was hanged on Passover Eve. What do you think the reference of the 40 days and the crying about proclaiming was of Christ's guilt? This was an attempt at covering up the illegal malfeasance that took place in connection with Christ's bogus trial and his ultimate execution, neatly covering up their tracks. Now, give a little thought to that in their own writing, this is not writing that's even possibly contaminated, like people say, oh, Josephus, he had motives, he might have been paid off. We're talking about a document, a book that was written by Jews for Jews with the idea of eradicating Christ. They had to go cover their tracks. Then you've got, still outside of the New Testament, we're talking about outside of the realm proof, Lucian, a 2nd century writer who ridiculed and berated Christians, wrote, "The Christians you know worship this man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage." Now, I point that out as a very invaluable piece of information because, like anything, you'll have people that say Jesus didn't even live. Even the prophet Muhammad acknowledges Jesus lived, although he only acknowledges him as a prophet. Even, and we're talking about 632 years after Christ, more than that, it would be 600 and whatever years after Christ's death, we still have somebody who basically will become a founder of another faith, acknowledging that Christ lived. So it's very interesting to see how these things, Lucian, for example, completely ridiculing the Christians. Tacitus, on the other hand, is considered by some as Rome's greatest historian. He wrote in 115 AD in his Annals of Imperial Rome regarding the burning of Rome in the mid-60s. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their adherence called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of our procurator, Pontius Pilate, and most mischievous superstition then checked for a moment, then again broke out not only in Judea, but in Rome. These are the words of a famed historian, basically acknowledging the fact that the killing of Christ did not eradicate the followers of Christ. And you have to kind of put all this in perspective. You have internal evidences that we could pick apart, which I haven't done. I don't have time to do it. We've got external evidences that are enough to mount a case. And then you turn to archaeological evidences. Now, Pontius Pilate, many people for the longest time, whether if you read books like Carol Quigley's books, anything that represented the history of Rome, you'd have scant references to Pontius Pilate. Until 1961, there was only one reference of proof outside of the New Testament, and then a stone discovered at Caesarea in Israel reads Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And there are many more evidences like this. If one is willing to look, go search them out. There are wonderful biblical archaeology reviews. There are plenty of real people out there. Some will even be the finders of such great archaeological finds, and yet the greatest deniers that it could belong to a time or a place or an origin as such, because it goes against everything that they themselves hold to believe is true. This, by the way, is what I'm against. I've told you, if I find something different, there is no ego here. I'll come and tell you I found contrary to what I've told you, and I'll just say it out loud, because we're here for the truth. It's a pursuit of that, not a pursuit of egomania or who's going to sound the most right most of the time. If we are going for archaeological, and this is where, if you asked me, I could probably devote several hours to this, because there is so much evidence, not just New Testament. The digs that have been going on, and we're not even talking about, I was a big fan, read every piece of literature from Kathleen Kenyon, who I admired as a woman in the 1950s, really a pioneer in her area, in her expertise, but she could not get the blinders off of her eyes to see that because certain things didn't fit in a box for her, they had to be whole cloth thrown away as plausible evidence to corroborate either biblical events or other historical events leading back to the Bible. So this is a very cautionary tale when you're going down this road of archaeology. Make sure that you listen to both voices. There are those who will say it doesn't belong here, it has no place, it doesn't belong to a timeline, and others that will give you a reason for why it does or give you more information. Make sure you're getting a balance in all of this, because not everything is open to speculation, especially with the immense advances in dating. We're no longer dependent on carbon dating, which is an antiquated technology. We now have much better tools beyond ultrasound, and the things that are used now to see and understand and evaluate are far superior than even 20 years ago. So be careful about what you read and make sure it's up to date as well. But if we're going for archaeological evidence, John mentions the pool of Bethsaida surrounded by 5 porticos near the Sheep Gate. The first unearthing of that took place in 1881 when archaeologists discovered the remains of a pool with 5 porticos. Now you might say, well, that's great, and what's the big deal? Perhaps the writer used that fanciful place, embellishing his own personal writing. If you're going to go down that pathway, but there's a little problem. You see, in 2005, they unearthed what we read about as the Siloam pool. In 2005, they unearthed that, and a wonderful discovery was made. Evidence shows that the southern basin had several steps with landings indicating it was a mikveh. And a mikveh is still used to this day in Jewish tradition as a ritual bath of cleansing. People go to the mikveh. Even today, there's even a mobile mikveh, if you can believe that. I remember living in New York City and seeing the mobile mikveh pull up in a certain area. And, it's very interesting how they would do that. Let's leave that one alone. I don't want to insult anybody right now. But the idea was that people would basically go for ritual cleansing, and also at the same time, it was a place where people would petition the Lord for healing. So if we're still on the subject of archaeological material, in 1990, the Caiaphas ossuary is found near Jerusalem. Caiaphas, as you remember, was the high priest during the crucifixion. You'll find that in Matthew 26:57. In 2011, the ossuary of Caiaphas' granddaughter is found, which basically just tells you this wasn't a one-off find, that whole family's bones were probably placed in ossuaries. And the ossuary of Alexander, the son of Simon the Cyrene, out of Mark 15:21, equally found. Now that's just on we'll call it the archaeological finds. But in terms of documentation, and I've said this before, we have over 5,500 pieces, manuscripts, fragments, papyrus that are all tied into, all relevant to, all belonging to, and a part of the New Testament. An important manuscript which you've heard me, and I'm starting at the furthest and working my way in. An important manuscript which you've heard me reference and I've used many times here in times past, called P46, or the Chester Beatty Papyri, which has its dating to approximately no later than 250 AD, is perhaps almost not quite, but the most extant, if you want to call it that. It's been analyzed, it's been parsed, it's been looked at, prodded, picked over. We know that that's a pretty accurate date. Then you go a little bit closer. The Bodmer Papyri, which contains most of John's Gospel, it dates to about 200 AD. The Rylands Papyri contains fragments of John, and it is dated to 130 AD. Then there's the discovery by one Jose Callahan from Cave 7 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He discovered a fragment of Mark's Gospel, and it is dated to 50 AD. He also discovered fragments of Acts and other epistles dating them just a little bit after 50 AD as well in that same cave. So here's the question. Early dating, early evidences. We have coherence. I haven't even gotten to, as I said, most of my numbers here. So I'm going to jump from archaeological evidences to number 7 here, negative or shameful reports, very quickly. This one, at least in this section, I can tell you, if I were to fabricate a document and wanting people to believe it and wanting to sell it to you whole cloth, there are certain things I would not include in the writing. The first glaring one that we encounter as a shameful, negative, or pejorative report that does damage to the witnesses or the text is the unbelief of James, the brother of Jesus, prior to the crucifixion. You find that in Mark 3:20 through 25 and John 7:5. Then there's the disbelief of Jesus' disciples and the reaction to him telling them of his impending death and that he came to die and about his resurrection before it happened. Mark 8:31, Mark 9:31, Mark 10:32, and Mark 14:27, just as examples. Why would you include that? Your own followers don't even believe you or understand what you're saying. That is harmful to someone trying to make a case. Then there is this, the reactions to those who find the empty tomb. And some of it's a little bit weird because we know the texts were chopped or altered. But in a perfect tale, you would not, and this is a case that's been made here many times, you would not have women be the eyewitnesses. The Synoptic Gospels, the role of the women as eyewitnesses is crucial. Why? Because they see Jesus die, they see his body being buried and laid in a tomb, they find the tomb empty, and the fact that some of the women were at all 3 of these events, they could testify that Jesus was dead and then placed in the tomb, and that he was buried, and that he subsequently that the tomb was empty. The only problem is that, and in this particular day of the writing of this time, women could not testify in a court of law. Their testimony was invalid. So if you are making a case to sell this to the rest of the world as a bogus myth or some bad lie, why would you put the women in there? Now that's always been staggering, but then I decided to make a little bit of a chart. I think I have time to do it, so let's do it. Mary Magdalene. She is recorded at all 3 events. She is recorded by Matthew. She is recorded by Mark. And of course, Luke can't contribute, but we know she's also recorded by John. Why do you think there was an attempt, as I've said many times, to demonize her, to vilify her, to discredit her, to make her a woman of ill repute? And even if she was at that, she became a faithful follower of Christ, an eyewitness to all these events. So why not discredit her? We know in part why she was discredited at a later time through the Roman Catholic Church, as they worried that Mary, the mother of Jesus, would not get the veneration, but Mary Magdalene would. And if you read about, there are a lot of writings that describe ultimately where Mary Magdalene ends up, and I do believe she ended up in the south of France with a lot of other folks that were scared for their life and went to preach the gospel, and this is why you've got a land full of crosses with names like Mary and Joseph everywhere abundantly. But the main thing here is to show, if you were making a case and you were building this as a trial, the one thing you would not do is you would not have all of these women being eyewitnesses to cross, burial, and empty tomb. And then to have it put down in a record that's going to be distributed No one knew, by the way, at the time. I don't think they realized that they were writing something that would become the best-selling book ever written, to say it like that. To understand how, in this day and age, somebody would say, well, what's wrong with that? But in the social setting of that day and age, this would be harmful to your case. This would be hurtful to make this evidentiary. If we were going into a court of law, they'd say, dismissed, it's thrown out. You can't enter it into evidence. So what do you have? You have the testimony of the rest of the disciples who basically ran off. Again, a negative report, a pejorative thing. I go a-fishing. Basically, I don't have time for this. They didn't even recognize Jesus on the shoreline when he was standing there making them a little bit of breakfast, bacon and eggs, just saying, all right? So this is why it's important to analyze all this. And this is, again, you cannot do an exhaustive examination of the evidence in 1 hour. And Lord knows I've tried with every breath to just cram it all in. But the real thing that I want people, especially those who still sit on the fence and they still think Jesus is this mythological figure. We have more evidence in what I've just presented, and I haven't even exhausted it, of who Jesus was, what he represented, how he lived his life, even though in brevity recorded about the space of 3 years. We have enough information to put together a profile of a person who was man and God. We have enough abundant witnesses. If you were to take the time to write down every person that came in contact with Christ, whether they were haters, high religious Sanhedrin, Pharisees, those who came, oh, this man sits with sinners. How dare this man? Think of all the personages that we encounter through the New Testament. It has to become abundantly clear that if somebody is wanting to look for evidence, they'll find it. And if someone's wanting to scrutinize this, go ahead and scrutinize it, because there's something wonderful that happens. You know, some of the most interesting people started off as atheists. One of them, of course, is C.S. Lewis. Started off as, this is all for somebody else, it's all fantastic. And here was a thinking man, an academic man, and there's so many more like him, that took the time, okay, albeit at first influenced by some influential friends to be encouraged to look, but once they had taken a look, and we're talking about spending more than 5 minutes or a day, we're talking about taking the time to investigate whether or not this man, this historical persona that claimed to be savior of the world, really was who he said he was, and the claims that he made of himself. No other founder of any of the world's religions has ever made. If you compare them all, if you line them all up, there is no possibility, especially if you think about, and I say this, as early as, now they have a new date, they've unearthed something that makes Buddha much earlier than originally thought, unearthing a tomb that is much earlier, that definitely pushes him back in time. But as far back as you want to go, and you look at that evidence, Buddha never said he was God. He became deified and became a god much later. And as we know, the prophet Muhammad lived 632 years after Jesus Christ. I'm saying he lived in that time period. Enough time for the New Testament to be circulated, enough time for the book, both old and new, basically the Septuagint and versions of it, and then of course versions of the New Testament had already been circulating. Certainly a plethora of Latin Vulgates had already made its course around the world when this fledgling religion of Islam comes on the scene. Now, I heard somebody argue and say that there's more documented evidence for the Prophet Muhammad than there is for Jesus. Well, then I indulge you to take the challenge and weigh them out and see what you can find, because the reality is the Quran only includes 3 or 4 references to Muhammad, versus the Bible that is replete, both old and new, the ones that prophesy and the ones that speak directly of him. And you have to go to another book outside of the Quran to learn about Muhammad. Here is compiled in one book what was foretold of him in the old, and the prophecies of his coming and the prophecies of his return, which, by the way, had those prophecies of his birth and his coming and what he was going to represent had not been made good, we could all call it a day and go home and say, it's all over. It was just a farce. Our faith is misplaced. and we're a bunch of fools. But like Paul said, if Christ be not risen, our faith is vain. But we have abundant proof, and I have not even scratched the surface. And what I want to inspire in people, maybe not for the older audience here, but for a younger listening audience, don't be naive. Don't listen to fairy tales. Don't take something as whole cloth mythology, like people will say the Genesis is just an account of some older mythological tale that's been rewoven and rewritten. Well, I'd like to challenge that too someday. But for right now, my focus is to put out the information, the debate about the historical Jesus Christ, who he was, who he is, what he represents to this time, this day and age, is very important. In fact, probably the most important thing that could happen to this generation coming up is to rediscover this book and the faith that it represents and the moorings of social and, we'll call it, a mindset of faith that does not let, as Jesus said, you render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, but you render to God that which is God's. And if I belong to him like you belong to him, you show yourself as someone who desires to know who this Jesus Christ of Nazareth is, and if he existed, which I can certify to you, I've got more proof that he did, then it should mean something both for us today who already know who he is and not take him for granted and not be complacent, and for a whole new generation who has yet to uncover in a mind that basically gives a trophy for just showing up what God can do if you'll take a second look and analyze the evidence that, in the famous words of Josh McDowell's book, demand a verdict. I hope you make your mind up today. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.